by John Lothe and is intended for educational purposes. This recording is not to be sold or distributed for sale. If you wish to support the work and publishing of these recordings, please visit the John Lothe Patreon page. If you come across these recordings anywhere else without my expressed support, and find that they are requesting donations for presenting this work to you, you will not be supporting the creator by doing so. This is just a friendly warning to anyone who may fall prey to predatory practices I have come across recently. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 11. Changing Economic Patterns. France. Financial capitalism lasted longer in France than in any other major country. The roots of financial capitalism there, like Holland, but unlike Germany, go back to the period of commercial capitalism, which preceded the Industrial Revolution. These roots grew rapidly in the last half of the 18th century, and were well established with the founding of the Bank of France in 1800. At that date, financial power was in the hands of about 10 or 15 private banking houses, whose founders, in most cases, had come from Switzerland in the second half of the 18th century. These bankers, all Protestant, were deeply involved in the agitations leading up to the French Revolution. When the revolutionary violence got out of hand, they were the chief forces behind the rise of Napoleon, whom they regarded as the restorer of order. As a reward for this support, Napoleon in 1800 gave these bankers a monopoly over French financial life by giving them control of the new Bank of France. By 1811, most of these bankers had gone over to the opposition to Napoleon because they objected to his continuation of a warlike policy. France at that time was still in the stage of commercial capitalism, and constant war was injurious to commercial activity. As a result, this group shifted its allegiance from Bonaparte to Bourbon and survived the change in regime in 1815. This established a pattern of political agility which was repeated with varying success in subsequent changes of regime. As a result, the Protestant bankers who had controlled financial life under the First Empire were still the main figures on the Board of Regents of the Bank of France until the Reform of 1936. Among these figures, the chief bore the names Maribond, Mallet, Neuflize, and Houtangi. In the course of the 19th century, a second group was added to French banking circles. This second group, largely Jewish, was also of non-French origin, the majority Germanic, like Rothschild, Hein, Fauld, Stern, and Worms, and the minority of Iberian origin, like Pire and Meurice. A rivalry soon grew up between the older Protestant bankers and the newer Jewish bankers. This rivalry was largely political rather than religious in its basis, and the lines were confused by the fact that some of the Jewish group gave up their religion and moved over to the Protestant group, such as Pire and Hein. The rivalry between these two groups steadily increased because of their differing political attitudes toward the July monarchy, 1830 to 1848, the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870, and the Third Republic, 1871 to 1940. In this rivalry, the Protestant group was more conservative than the Jewish group, the former being lukewarm toward the July monarchy, enthusiastic toward the Second Empire, and opposed to the Third Republic. The Jewish group, on the other hand, warmly supported the July monarchy and the Third Republic, but opposed the Second Empire. In this rivalry, the leadership of each group was centered in the richest and more moderate banking family. The leadership of the Protestant group was exercised by Mahriboud, which was of the left wing of the group. The leadership of the Jewish group was held by Rothschild, which was of the right wing of that group. These two wings were so close that Marabud and Rothschild, who together dominated the whole financial system, being richer and more powerful than all other private banks combined, frequently cooperated together, even when their groups as a whole were in competition. This simple picture was complicated after 1838 by the slow rise of a third group of bankers who were Catholics. This group, including such names as Desmarchis, Sillier, de Vallière, de Germany, Pillet-Will, Gouin, and de Lubersac, rose slowly and late. It soon split into two halves. One half formed an alliance with the Rothschild group and accepted the Third Republic. The other half formed an alliance with the rising power of heavy industry, largely Catholic, and rose with it, forming under the Second Empire and early Third Republic a powerful industrial banking group whose chief overt manifestation was the Comité des Forges, the French Steel Trust. Thus, there were, in the period 1871 to 1900, three great groups in France. A. The alliance of Jews and Catholics dominated by Rothschild. B. The alliance of Catholic industrialists and Catholic bankers dominated by Schneider, the steel manufacturer. And C. The group of Protestant bankers dominated by Marabun. The first of these accepted the Third Republic. The other two rejected the Third Republic. The first waxed wealthy in the period 1871 to 1900, chiefly through its control of the greatest French investment bank, the Banque de Paris et de Pays-Bas, Paribas. This Paribas bloc, by 1906, had a dominant position in French economic and political life. In opposition to Paribas, the Protestant bankers established an investment bank of their own, the Union Parisienne, in 1904. In the course of the period 1904 to 1919, the Union Parisienne group and the Comité des Forges group formed an alliance based on their common opposition to the Third Republic and the Paribas bloc. This new combination we might call the Union Comité bloc. The rivalry of these two great powers, the Paribas bloc and the Union Comité bloc, fills the pages of French history in the period 1884 to 1940. It paralyzed the French political system, reaching the crisis stage in the Dreyfus case and again in 1934 to 1938. It also partially paralyzed the French economic system, delaying the development from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism and preventing economic recovery from the Depression in the period 1935 to 1940. It contributed much to the French defeat in 1940. At present, we are concerned only with the economic aspects of this struggle. In France, the stage of commercial capitalism continued much longer than in Britain, and did not begin to be followed by industrial capitalism until after 1830. The stage of financial capitalism, in turn, did not really begin until about 1880, and the stage of monopoly capitalism became evident only about 1925. During all this period, the private bankers continued to exist and grow in power. Founded in commercial capitalism, they were at first chiefly interested in governmental obligations, both domestic and foreign. As a result, the greatest private bankers, like the Rothschilds or Malays, had intimate connections with governments and relatively weak connections with the economic life of the country. It was the advent of the railroad in the period 1830 to 1870 which changed this situation. The railroads required capital far beyond the ability of any private banker to supply from his own resources. The difficulty was met by establishing investment banks, deposit banks, saving banks, and insurance companies, which gathered the small savings of a multitude of persons and made these available for the private banker to direct wherever he thought fitting. Thus, the private banker became a manager of other persons' funds rather than a lender of his own. In the second place, the private banker now became much more influential and much less noticeable. He now controlled billions, where formerly he had controlled millions, and he did it unobtrusively, no longer in the open in his own name, but acting from the background, concealed from public view by the plethora of financial and credit institutions which had been set up to tap private savings. The public did not notice that the names of private bankers and their agents still graced the list of directors of the new financial enterprises. In the third place, the advent of the railroad brought into existence new economic powers, especially in iron-making and coal mining. These new powers, the first powerful economic influences in the state free from private banking control, arose in France from an activity very susceptible to governmental favor and disfavor: the armaments industry. Industrial capitalism began in France, as elsewhere, in the fields of textiles and iron-making. The beginning may be discerned before 1830, but the growth was slow at all times. There was no lack of capital, since most Frenchmen were careful savers, but they preferred fixed interest obligations, usually government bonds, to equity capital, and would rather invest in family enterprises than in securities of other origin. The use of the corporation form of business organization grew very slowly, although it was permitted by French law in 1807, earlier than elsewhere. Private proprietorships and partnerships remained popular, even in the 20th century. Most of these were financed from profits and family savings, as in England. When these were successful and increased in size, the owners frequently cut off the growth of the existing enterprise and started one or more new enterprises alongside the old one. These sometimes engaged in the identical economic activity, but more frequently engaged in a closely related activity. Strong family feeling hampered the growth of large units or publicly owned corporations because of reluctance to give outsiders an influence in family businesses. The preference for fixed interest obligations over equity securities as investments made it difficult for corporations to grow in size easily and soundly. Finally, the strong feeling against public authority, especially the tax collector, increased the reluctance to embark in public rather than private forms of business organization. Nonetheless, industry grew, receiving its greatest boost from the advent of the railroad, with its increased demand for steel and coal, and from the government of Napoleon III, 1852 to 1870, which added a new demand for armaments to the industrial market. Napoleon showed special favor to one firm of iron and armament makers, the firm of Schneider, at Le Creusot. Eugene Schneider obtained a monopoly in supplying arms to the French government, sold materials to government-encouraged railway construction, became president of the Chamber of Deputies, and Minister of Agriculture and Commerce. It is hardly surprising that the industrialists looked back on the period of the Second Empire as a kind of golden age. The loss of political influence by the heavy industrialists after 1871 reduced their profits and drove them to ally with the Catholic bankers. Thus, the struggle between financial capitalism and monopoly capitalism, which appeared in most countries, was replaced, in France, by a clash between two economic blocs, both of which were interested in both industry and banking, and neither of which was prepared to accept the unorthodox banking procedures which became one of the chief goals of monopoly capitalism. As a result, monopoly capitalism appeared late in France, and when it did, arose between the two great blocs, with ramifications in both, but largely autonomous from the central control of either. This new autonomous and rather amorphous group, which reflected the rise of monopoly capitalism, may be called the Lille-Lyons axis. It rose slowly after 1924 and took over the control of France after the defeat of 1940. The rise of financial capitalism in France, as elsewhere, was made possible by the demand for capital for railroad building. The establishment of the Crédit Mobilier in 1852, with 60 million francs in assets, may be taken as the opening date for French financial capitalism. This bank was the model for the credit banks established in Germany later, and, like them, conducted a mixed business of savings accounts, commercial credit, and investment banking. The Crédit Mobilier failed in 1867, but others were founded afterward, some mixed, others more specialized on the British or American pattern. Once begun, financial capitalism in France displayed the same excesses as elsewhere. In France, these were worse than those in Britain or Germany after the reforms of 1884, although they were not to be compared with the excesses of frenzy and fraud displayed in the United States. In France, as in Britain, the chief exploits of financial capitalism in the 19th century were to be found in the foreign field and in government rather than in business securities. The worst periods of delirium were in the early 1850s, again in the early 1880s, and again in much of the 20th century. In 1 year of the first period, July 1st, 1854 to July 1st, 1855, no less than 457 new companies with combined capital of 1 billion francs were founded in France. The losses to security buyers were so great that on March 9th, 1856, the government had to prohibit temporarily any further issue of securities in Paris. Again, in the period 1876 to 1882, over 1 billion francs of new stocks were issued, leading to a crash in 1882. And finally, in the whole period 1900 to 1936, financial capitalism was clearly in control in France. In 1929, a Paris newspaper estimated that in a period of 30 years, from the Humbert embezzlement of 1899, more than 300 billion francs, equivalent to the total public and private debt of France in 1929, had been taken from the French people by worthless securities. The center of the French economic system in the 20th century was not to be found, as some have believed, in the Bank of France, but, instead, resided in a group of almost unknown institutions, the private banks. There were over 100 of these private banks, but only about a score were of significance, and even in this restricted group, two, Rothschild and Mirabeau, were more powerful than all the others combined. These private banks were known as the Haute Banque and acted as the high command of the French economic system. Their stock was closely held in the hands of about 40 families, and they issued no reports on their financial activities. They were, with a few exceptions, the same private banks which had set up the Bank of France. They were divided into a group of 7 Jewish banks: Rothschild, Stern, Gahan-Dovers, Proper, Lazard, Spitzer, and Worms; a group of 7 Protestant banks: Mallet, Mirabeau, Hein, Neuflis, Ottinger, Odier, and Verne; and a group of 5 Catholic banks: De Vallière, Lubersac, Louis-Dieu, Goudchou, and Desmachy. By the 20th century, the basic fissure to which we have referred had appeared between the Jews and the Protestants, and the Catholic group had split to ally itself either with the Jews or with the forces of monopolistic heavy industry. Nonetheless, the various groups continued to cooperate in the management of the Bank of France. The Bank of France was not the center of French financial capitalism, except nominally, and possessed no autonomous power of its own. It was controlled until 1936, as it had been in 1813, by the handful of private banks which created it. except that in the 20th century, some of these were closely allied with an equally small but more amorphous group of industrialists. In spite of the fissure, the two blocs cooperated with each other in their management of this important instrument of their power. The Bank of France was controlled by the 40 families, not 200 as frequently stated, because of the provision in the bank's charter that only the 200 largest stockholders were entitled to vote for the members of the Board of Regents, the governing board of the bank. There were 182,500 shares of stock outstanding, each with a face value of 1,000 francs, but usually worth 5 or 10 times that. In the 20th century, there were 30,000 to 40,000 stockholders. Of the 200 who could vote for the 12 elected regents, 78 were corporations or foundations, and 122 were individuals. Both classes were dominated by the private banks, and had been for so long that the regents' seats had become practically hereditary. The chief changes in the names of regents were caused by the growth of heavy industry and the transfer of seats through female lines. 3 seats were held by the same families for well over a century. In the 20th century, the names of Rothschild, Mallet, Maribaud, Louis-Philippe, de Vallière, Vernes, Ottinger, and their relatives were consistently on the Board of Regents. The Bank of France acted as a kind of general staff for the 40 families which controlled the 19 chief private banks. Little effort was made to influence affairs by the rediscount rate, and open market operations were not used until 1938. The state was influenced by the Treasury's need for funds from the Bank of France. Other banks were influenced by methods more exclusively French, by marriage alliances, by indirect bribery, that is, by control of well-paying sinecures in banking and industry, and by the complete dependence of French banks on the Bank of France in any crisis. This last arose from the fact that French banks did not emphasize gold reserves, but instead regarded commercial paper as their chief reserve. In any crisis where this paper could not be liquidated fast enough, the banks resorted to the unlimited note-issuing power of the Bank of France. In the third line of control of the French economy were the investment banks, called Banques d'Affaires. These were dominated by 2 banks, the Banque de Paris des Pays-Bas, set up by the Rothschild Group in 1872, and the Banque de l'Union Parisienne, founded by the rival bloc in 1904. These investment banks supplied long-term capital to industry and took stock and directorships in return. Much of the stock was resold to the public, but the directorships were held indefinitely for control purposes. In 1931, Paribas held the securities of 357 corporations, and its own directors and top managers held 180 directorships in 120 of the more important of these. The control was frequently made easier by the use of non-voting stock, multiple voting stock, cooptative directorships, and other refinements of financial capitalism. For example, the General Wireless Company, set up by Paribas, distributed 200,000 shares of stock worth 500 francs a share. Of these, 181,818 shares sold to the public had 1/10 vote each, while 18,182 shares, held by the insider group, had 1 vote each. A similar situation was to be found in Havas stock, also issued by Paribas. The investment bank of the non-Jewish private banks and their industrial allies was the Union Parisienne. Among its 16 directors were to be found such names as Maribaud, Ottinger, Louis-Philippe, Vernes, Wendel, Lubersac, and Schneider in the period before 1934. The two largest stockholders in 1935 to 1937 were Lubbersac and Mallet. The directors of this bank held 124 other directorships on 90 important corporations in 1933. At the same time, it held stock in 338 corporations. The value of the stock held by the Union Parisienne in 1932 was 482.1 million francs, and of that, held by Paribas was 548.8 million francs, giving a total for both of 1,030.9 million francs. In the fourth line of control were 5 chief commercial banks, with 4,416 branches in 1932. At the beginning of the century, these had all been within the Paribas Consortium. But after the founding of the Union Parisienne in 1904, they slowly drifted over to the new bloc, the Comptoir National des Comptes, going over almost at once, with the others following more slowly. As a result, the control of the two great blocs over the great deposit banks was rather mixed during the 20th century, with the old Jewish group of private bankers losing ground rather steadily. The decline of this group was closely related to the decline of international financial capitalism and received its worst blow in the losses in foreign bonds resulting from the First World War. Regional deposit banks were controlled in varying degrees by one or the other of the two blocs, the Paribas control being stronger in the north, west, and south, while the Union Comité bloc was stronger in the northeast, east, and southeast. Control of savings banks and insurance companies was also shared, especially where they had been founded before the two blocs achieved their modern form. For example, the largest insurance company in France, with capital and reserves of 2,463 million francs in 1931, had as directors such names as Mallet, Rothschild, Neufelice, Ottinger, and so on. This cooperation between the two blocs in regard to the lower levels of the banking system and the Bank of France itself did not usually extend to industrial or commercial activity. There, competition outside the market was severe and became a struggle to the death in 1932 to 1940. In some activities, spheres of interest were drawn between the two groups, and thus competition was reduced. Inside France, there was the basic division between East and West, the Jewish group emphasizing shipbuilding, transatlantic communications and transportation, and public utilities in the West, while the Protestant Catholic group emphasized iron, steel, and armaments in the East. Outside France, the former group dominated the colonies, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, while the latter group emphasized Central and Eastern Europe, chiefly through the Union Européenne Industrielle et Financière, created in 1920 to be the economic counterpart of the Little Entente. In some fields, the rivalry of the two groups had worldwide ramifications. In petroleum products, for example, the Jewish bankers, through the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, controlled the Compagnie Française des Pétroles, which was allied to Standard Oil and Rockefeller, while the Catholic Protestant bankers, through the Union Parisienne, controlled Petrofina, which was allied to Royal Dutch Shell and Dieterding. Jules X. Bryant, partner of Desmarquet et Sieux, in which François de Wendel was majority owner, was a director of Union Parisienne and of Petrofina, and Alexandre Bongonnier, partner of Lubbersac et Signe, was also a director of Union Parisienne and of Petrofina. Charles Sargent, once Undersecretary of the Ministry of Finance and Sub-Governor of the Bank of France, was for years chairman of the Union Parisienne and played a role in one bloc similar to that played by Horace Finley in the other bloc. He was a director of Petrofina and of the Union Européenne Industrielle et Foncière. When he retired for reasons of health in 1938, he was replaced in several positions, including Petrofina and Union Parasigné, by Jean Tannery, honorary governor of the Bank of France. At the same time, Joseph Courcelles, former inspector of finances, was a director of 17 companies, including Petrofina and Union Parasigné. On the other side, Horace Finelly was general manager of Paribas and director of Standard Franco-Américaine, while his son was a director of Seu Français de Pétroles. Former ambassador Jules Cambon and Émile Audot, both directors of Paribas, were respectively directors of Standard Franco-Américaine and Standard Franco de Pétroles, before these merged in 1938. Outside the banking system which we have sketched, the French economy was organized in a series of trade associations, industrial monopolies, and cartels. These were usually controlled by the Catholic Protestant bloc of private bankers, since the Jewish group continued to use the older methods of financial capitalism, while their rivals moved forward to the more obvious methods of monopoly capitalism. In such cases, individual companies controlled by the Jewish group frequently joined the cartels and associations set up by the rival bloc. After the center of the system of monopolistic industrial controls was the Confédération Générale du Patronat Français, or General Confederation of French Employers, which after 1936, Matignon agreements, did the collective bargaining for most French industry. The Confederation was divided into sections for different branches of industry. Around the Confederation was a series of general trade associations and cartels, such as the Comité des Forges, or Committee Forges, Comité Central des Collieries, or Central Committee of Collieries, Union des Industries Métallurgiques et Minières, or Union of Metallurgical and Mining Industries, Société de l'Industrie Minérale, or Society of the Mineral Industry, and so on. Below these were a large number of regional associations and local cartels. These were integrated into a single whole by financial controls, family alliances, and interlocking positions. In this system, the Committee Forges, trade association of the metallurgical industry, held a key position. In France, the iron industry was originally widely scattered in small enterprises. Of these, the factories at Le Creusot, acquired by the Schneider family in 1838, were so favored by Napoleon III that they began to emerge as the chief metal company in France. As a result, the loss of governmental privileges by the shift from Second Empire to Third Republic, and the blow to Schneider's prestige from the victory of Krupp steel cannon over Le Creusot's bronze cannon in 1870, the whole metal industry of France began to turn toward monopoly and to seek capital from private bankers. The turn toward monopoly appeared almost at once, especially in the typical French form of the comptoir, a joint selling agency. In 1884, as we have said, the Committee Forges were formed as an association of all the metallurgical industries of France, using a single comptoir to prevent price competition. By the 20th century, the Committee Forges consisted of representatives of over 200 companies with nominal capital of about 8 billion francs, but whose securities were worth almost 100 billion francs in 1939. Of the 200 corporations, the chief, perhaps, were establishments Schneider, Les Forges et Acières de la Marine et Home Court, or Ironworks and Aciéries Navy and Home Court. Les Sociétés des Petits-Fils de François de Wendel, or the Company of Grandchildren and Son of François de Wendel. Les Aciéries de Longwy, or the Aciéries Le Longwy, and so on. By the year 1939, 75% of French steel production was from 6 companies. The monopolistic influences, however, were much stronger than these figures would indicate. Of the 200 firms in the Committee Forge, only 70 were of importance in iron and steel. These 70 had an aggregate capitalization of about 4 billion francs. Of these firms, 51, with 2,727,054,000 francs of capital in 1939, were in the Union Committee bloc and were controlled by a Schneider-Marabut alliance. 11 corporations with 506 million francs of capital were in the Paribas bloc. 8 firms with 749 million francs of capital were in neither bloc or doubtful. A somewhat similar development is to be found in the French coal industry. This, perhaps, is not surprising, as the coal industry was largely dominated by the same groups as the steel industry. By 1938, 77% of French coal production came from 14 companies. 3 of these companies were owned by Wendel, who thus controlled 15.3% of French coal output directly, and considerably more indirectly. Parallel to the Committee Forges in steel and controlled by the same group was the Central Committee of Collieries in coal. This was supported by taxes on collieries based on output. Voting power within the organization was based on this financial contribution, so that 13 companies controlled over 3/4 of the votes, and Wendel over 1/6. The French coal industry was controlled nearly as completely by the Union Committee bloc as was the steel industry. Coal in France was found chiefly in 2 areas, the northwest around Lille and the southeast about Lyons. The latter was controlled almost completely by the Union Committee bloc, but the Paribas influence was very great in the far richer northern area. It was these Paribas coal mines of the north which gradually drifted away and became one of the chief elements in the monopolistic Lille-Lyons axis. The preponderant influence of the Union Committee bloc in such important fields as iron, steel, and coal was balanced to some extent by the skillful fashion in which the Paribas bloc had taken control of the strategic points in the fields of communications and publicity. There were only 1,506 corporations registered on the stock exchange in Paris in 1936. Of this number, only about 600 were important. If we add to these about 150 or 200 important corporations not registered in Paris, we have a total of about 800 firms. Of these 800, the Paribas bloc controlled, in 1936, almost 400, and the Union Committee bloc about 300. The rest were controlled by neither bloc. The superior number of firms controlled by Paribas was counterbalanced by the much heavier capitalization of the Union Committee firms. This in turn was counterbalanced by the fact that the Paribas firms were in strategic positions. The whole Paribas system in the 20th century was headed by the Baron Edouard de Rothschild, but the active head was René Meyer, manager of the Rothschild Bank and nephew by marriage of James Rothschild. The chief center of operations for the system was in the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, which was managed until 1937 by Horace Finlay, of a Hungarian Jewish family brought to France by Rothschild in 1880. From this bank was ruled much of the section of the French economy controlled by this bloc. Included in this section were many foreign and colonial enterprises, utilities, ocean shipping, airlines, shipbuilding, and, above all, communications. In this latter group were Sérieux Générale Transatlantique, or General Transatlantic Co., Sérieux Général de Télégraphie Sans Fils, or General Telegraph Without Sons Company, Radio France, Sérieux Français de Câbles Télégraphiques, or French Telegraph Cables Company, Sello International des Wagons-Lits, or International Car Beds Co., Havas, and Hachette. Havas was a great monopolistic news agency, as well as the most important advertising agency in France. It could, and did, suppress or spread both news and advertising. It usually supplied news reports gratis to those papers which would print the advertising copy it also provided. It received secret subsidies from the government for almost a century, a fact first revealed by Balzac. And by the late 1930s, these subsidies from the secret funds of the Popular Front had reached a fantastic size. Hachette had a monopoly on the distribution of periodicals and a sizable portion of the distribution of books. This monopoly could be used to kill papers which were regarded as objectionable. This was done in the 1930s to François Cotti's reactionary L'Ami du Peuple, or The Friend of the People. After 1934, the Union Committee bloc was badly injured by the World Depression, which fell on heavy industry more severely than on other segments of the economy. After 1937, the Paribas bloc was badly split by the rise of anti-Semitism, the controversy over orthodox and unorthodox financial methods for dealing with depression, and, above all, by the growing foreign crisis. The Rothschild desire to form an alliance with Russia and adopt a policy of resistance to Hitler while supporting loyalist Spain, continuing orthodox financial policies, and building up the labor unions against the committee forges, collapsed from its own internal contradictions, their own lack of faith in it, and the pressure of Great Britain. As the two older blocs thus weakened, a new bloc rose rapidly to power between them. This was the Lille-Lyons axis. It was constructed about two regional groups, one in the north about Lille, and the other in the southeast and east about Lyons, and in Alsace. The former had a branch running to Brussels in Belgium, while the latter had a branch running to Basel in Switzerland. The Lille end was originally under Rothschild influence, while the Lyons end was originally under Marabout influence. The two ends were integrated into a single unit by the activities of several private banks and two deposit banks in Paris. The private banks included Odier, Setter et Silleux, Sauter & Co., S. Proper et Silleux, S. Proper & Co., and Worms et Silleux, Worms & Co. The credit banks included the Crédit Commercial de France and Banque Française pour le Commerce et l'Industrie, or French Bank for Trade and Industry. This Lille-Lyons axis was built up about four economic activities: electrical utilities, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals. These four were monopolistic and interrelated, chiefly for technological reasons. They were monopolistic either by nature, public utilities, or because they were based on narrowly controlled natural resources, utilities and chemicals, or because they required large-scale operation, utilizing byproducts and affiliated activities for profitable operation, utilities, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals, or because they required use of closely held patents, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals. These activities were interrelated for various reasons. The public utilities of the north were based on coal, while those of the southeast were based on water power. The manufacture of light metals concentrated in the southeast because of the available water power. These metals, chiefly aluminum, were made by electrolysis, which provided chemical byproducts. Thus, the two light metals firms in France moved into the field of chemicals. The textile industry was already centered in the north, about Lille, and in the southeast, about Lyons. When this textile industry turned to artificial fibers, it had to ally with chemical firms. This was easy because the chemical firms of the southeast were already in close contact with the textile firms of Lyons, chiefly the Gillette family, while the chemical firms of the north were already in close contact with the textile firms of the area, chiefly the Mott family and its relatives. These textile firms of the north already controlled, in cooperation with Paribas, the richest coal mines of the area. These coal mines began to generate electrical power at the mine, utilizing all byproducts for chemicals and artificial textiles. Since the textiles families of the north, like Mott, were already related to the textiles families of the southeast, like Gillette, by marriage and by trade associations, it was easy for the Lille-Lyons axis to grow up along these lines. As a result of the stalemate between the two great blocs, between financial capitalists and monopoly capitalists, between supporters of the Russian alliance and supporters of appeasement, between orthodox and unorthodox financial measures, between Jews and anti-Semites, France was completely paralyzed and went down to defeat in 1940. This was quite acceptable to the Lille-Lyons axis. It accepted the defeat with satisfaction and, with German help, began to take over the whole economy of France. The Paribas bloc was destroyed by the anti-Semite laws, and many of its chief strongpoints taken over. The Union Committee bloc was badly crippled by a series of severe blows, including the forced sale of all Schneider's foreign holdings, and of most of Wendel's domestic holdings to the Germans, chiefly to the Hermann Göring Werk. The seizure of the other Lorraine iron properties, and the abolition of the Comité des Forges, and the abolition of the Committee Forges itself. At the same time, the Lille-Lyons axis strengthened itself. The French chemical industry, already largely monopolized by establishments Goldman, was forced into a single corporation, Société Francoleur, controlled by the Lille-Lyons axis and IG Farben. The light metals industry, already largely monopolized by Allais, Forges, and Camargue, was centralized almost completely in this firm. The artificial textile industry, already largely monopolized by the Gillette clique, was centralized under a single corporation, France Rayon, under joint Gillette-German control. The automobile industry was subjected to a single control, the Comité d'Organisation des Automobiles, or the Automobile Organization Committee, and set up a joint manufacturing company, Société Générale Française de Construction des Automobiles, or the Society of French General Automotive Manufacturing. The whole system was controlled by a small group in Lyons, centering about the Gillette family, and represented on the political scene chiefly by Pierre Laval. The struggles between these three great economic power blocs in France are rather difficult for Americans to understand because they were not reflected in price competition in the market where Americans would normally expect economic competition to appear. In the field of price policies, the three blocs generally cooperated. They also cooperated in their attitudes toward labor, although to a lesser degree. Their rivalries appeared in the fields of economic and political power as struggles to control sources of raw materials, supplies of credit and capital, and the instruments of government. Price competition, which to an American always has seemed to be the first and even the only method of economic rivalry, has, in Europe, generally been regarded as the last possible method of economic rivalry. A method so mutually destructive as to be tacitly avoided by both sides. In fact, in France, as in most European countries, competing economic groups saw nothing inconsistent in joining together to use the power of the state to enforce joint policies of such groups toward prices and labor. The French defeat in 1940 shattered the stalemate between the economic power blocs, which had paralyzed France in the 1930s and done so much to make the defeat possible. The two older blocs were disrupted under the German occupation and the Vichy regime. The Paralysis bloc by the anti-Semitic laws, and the Union Committee bloc because its holdings were desirable to the Germans and their French collaborators. The Lille-Lyons axis, led by the associates of the Banque Worms and the Banque de l'Indochine, or the Bank of Indochina, sought to take over most of the French economy as the willing collaborators of the Germans and their old associate, Pierre Laval, and were fairly successful in doing so. But the economic confusions of the occupation and the burden of the German occupation costs made it impossible to win any significant benefits from their position. Moreover, as collaborators with the Nazis, the Lille-Lyons axis could not expect to survive a German defeat, and it did not do so. The three pre-war blocs have played no significant role in France since 1945. Although some of the personnel of Paralysis have done so, notably René Meyer, active head of the Rothschild family interests who was Minister of Finance in the early post-war government. Later, in 1962, de Gaulle made the director of the Rothschild Bank, Georges Pompidou, Prime Minister. The rather prominent role played by bankers such as these did not prevent France from following the pattern of new economic procedures, which we have observed in other countries. The process was delayed by the political paralysis arising from the French parliamentary system, especially the instability of cabinets arising from the multiplicity of parties. The military crisis in Indochina, followed by the protracted and frustrating civil war in Algeria, prevented France from establishing any satisfactory economic system until 1958. The only achievement of the earlier period was, however, a very great one: the French role in establishing the European Common Market, which was decisive. This was established by the Treaty of Rome of 1957, with 6 members: France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Luxembourg. It planned to remove the internal customs barriers among its members by stages over at least a dozen years, while adopting a common external tariff against outsiders. In this way, a mass market would be provided which would allow mass production with lower costs. France was unable to contribute much to this new market until its political instability was ended by the establishment of the Fifth Republic, on a more authoritarian pattern, in 1958. Constitution of October 4th. In December of that year, the franc was devalued and a program of fiscal austerity was inaugurated. At once, economic activity began to rise. The rate of growth of industrial production reached 6.3% in 1961 and almost 8.5% in 1962. The gold reserves doubled within 2 years of the devaluation. The resulting prosperity, called an economic miracle in the 1962 report of the 20-Nation Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the successor organization to the Marshall Plan, was unevenly spread in that farmers and government employees obtained less than a fair share of it, and it was accompanied by an undesirable inflation of the cost of living, with 1953 as 100, to 103 in 1956, up to 138 in 1961, and to 144 in 1962. However, it brought France and the other common market countries to an unprecedented level of prosperity, which was in striking contrast to the drab conditions in the unfortunate countries within the Iron Curtain. The British, who had formed a European Free Trade Association of the Outer Seven, Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, to seek free trade among members but no common external tariff against others, sought to lift its rather lethargic economy by joining the common market in 1962, but was rebuffed by de Gaulle, who required as a price that Britain renounce its efforts, going back over decades, to establish a special relationship with the United States.